What's up everyone, CloakingDonkey here, and it is once again time for Camelot Unchained Examined, the series in which I tell you everything that I can find and that I know about Camelot Unchained and what the game hopefully is going to be when it launches. Now, one thing I forgot to mention in the other two episodes is please don't forget that this game is currently not even in beta yet. It is still in an alpha phase, which means that a lot of the things that I'm going to tell you in this series might very well change before the game actually reaches its release date. In the first episode I talked about combat, and in the second episode I talked about abilities. And with this third episode I'm going to close out everything that has to do with combat and character abilities and that basic gameplay for your class by talking about the A.I.R system. But before we get to the A.I.R system, there's one very important thing that I kind of just didn't talk about in the combat section. Probably because otherwise it would have been a bit too long. And that is spell casting and disruption. The system that they are shooting for in Camelot Unchained is kind of a mix between how things were done in Dark Age of Camelot and how things are done in World of Warcraft. To elaborate, in World of Warcraft, if you cast a spell and somebody hits you with a melee attack, it gives you a percentage decrease on your casting time, which just overall increases the time spent casting said spell. That mechanic is called setback. Setback cannot really interrupt your casting. You can pretty much get hit over and over and over. The spell will eventually go through. Setback isn't supposed to be a hard interrupt system because there is also an interrupt system. If you want to stop somebody from casting a spell, be it an NPC or a player, you just have to hit them with either a silence or an interrupt effect. Interrupt effects exist on most classes, and they usually also cause the target, after the spell has been interrupted, to be locked out of that school of spells for a few seconds. And silence will just prevent casting for a certain period of time. Now, in Dark Age of Camelot, this worked entirely different. If you were a casting character and you casted a spell, and somebody hit you with any damage whatsoever, or even just with an ability that didn't necessarily have to do damage, that just caused an effect on you, then your casting would instantly be interrupted. There were some ways around that, and sometimes the server lag would also definitely help you not to get interrupted, but in general terms, taking damage as a spellcaster would end your spellcasting, which meant as a spellcaster you had to be on your feet to ensure that you moved around enough to not get hit in the face by those ugly melee characters who wanted to stop you from casting. And because of this drawback, and of course the regular drawback of mages usually being a bit squishier than the warrior types, mages did a lot of damage in Dark Age of Camelot. They were really powerful damage-wise compared to the other classes in the game. And this is of course a fair trade-off. If you want to have powerful mages, there also needs to be a powerful way of disrupting their casting, because otherwise they are just going to be dominating the battlefield. Now, in Camelot Unchained, we are somewhere in between this. I told you about the different components that form abilities, and usually with these components there will also come a disruption health. And once you have all your components assembled for an ability, that ability will have a disruption health total. Other abilities that cause damage will cause a certain amount of damage and will also cause a certain amount of disruption damage. Now, some abilities will do more damage and less disruption damage, others will do less damage and more disruption damage, just based on the type of ability that is. For example, if your ability is a sucker punch, then it probably doesn't do all that much lasting health damage, but it is very likely to cause a lot of disruption damage, because getting punched in the face generally is a pretty big concentration breaker. And so as soon as you start casting a spell, the spell's disruption health will become active, and if it does take enough disruption damage to reduce this meter to 0, while you are still casting the spell will immediately be hard interrupted. Now, in basic terms, you could say it doesn't change all that much, because you're really still going to have the face-kicky interrupt type abilities that will interrupt spells, and you will have normal abilities that don't. But there are certain implications for this system that just come out of having it mapped out in such a way. Such as, for example, having a lot of people attack one target, even with non-disruption heavy attacks, will still cause the target to be interrupted, which you might not be able to in a system that doesn't use something like this. And then we of course also come to the point that disruption health becomes a balancing mechanic for spells. Say for example you have a really powerful spell that does a lot of damage or causes a devastating effect, you would give this spell a little less disruption health than other spells because that makes it easier to counter. And as such, you can put much more powerful magic into the game without completely breaking it, because at the same time you're giving the spell a disadvantage that other players can use to their advantage. Which in my opinion is a little bit more interesting than having mages be exactly as powerful as melee characters, have exactly as much health and so on, the way it is done in World of Warcraft. Alright, that's disruption. Let's move on to the A.I.R system. So the A.I.R system is an acronym and it stands for action, interaction, and reaction. Basically what this means is that spells and abilities in Camelot Unchained are supposed to interact with each other. And not just in pre-planned ways like it is in Guild Wars 2 for example, where you can for example put a fire ground effect down and then somebody fires a projectile through it and it gets set on fire and does more damage. That is a preset effect, something that is very much planned, and there really aren't that many variations of how this can be used. It really always works the same way. Somebody sets down the fire circle, somebody else shoots through it, sets his arrow or other projectile on fire and does more damage. In Camelot Unchained, however, they want to have a bit of a chaotic element in this. Now by chaotic element, I do not mean that it's going to be rife with RNG. What it does mean is there are supposed to be crazy chain reactions that aren't necessarily always planned, so that really interesting and crazy things happen on the battleground. And sure, some of those are going to be RNG, and sometimes they are going to work together in ways where you die and it may feel a little bit bullshit, but in the end that is not the intended goal of the system. The intended goal is to keep the game interesting. Because if you think about it, the Guild Wars 2 fire circle projectile interaction really isn't that interesting after the first couple of times you've done it. After that it just becomes a routine thing that you do with your team and it just is a normal tactic. However, when you have everything a little bit more chaotic and randomized, then situations will occur on the battlefield that will become memories. The Guild Wars 2 example wouldn't ever create memories because the same outcome is always going to happen. And so I think this is a good idea, but it is definitely also a very ambitious system. And this is also why this time I made sure I had the disclaimer at the beginning of the video, because this could be one of those systems that just doesn't make it into the game exactly the way they want it to happen, because it is going to be very difficult and is going to involve a lot of physics stuff, and will have to be quite heavily server-side, and so there might be issues with the client, and we'll just have to see how it develops. However, the idea of it is pretty cool. Now, I'm going to give you an example that was given by the CSE team, because quite honestly, there could be millions of possibilities with this system, or there could be a very limited amount. And I don't want to promise you something amazing that then just isn't going to happen, because the system isn't even built for it. And so this example actually comes from the rehabilitation stream, where they were talking about all the stuff that they were doing for this specific rebuilding of the ability system. Specifically for this example, they were talking about logs and how everything could be tracked and traced back to certain targets. And so the example was that Ben, who is a forest stalker, an archer from the Tuatha realm, fires an arrow which then lands on the ground and creates a plant, because that's the class mechanic for this specific class. And this plant fires off a projectile, which then hits a wall and has an interaction effect. So we're going to say it is a firewall, because that makes the most sense. And let's say the plant fired a pollen sac. And this pollen sac strikes the firewall, which then explodes and turns all the pollen-y, dusty goodness inside into little fireballs, which fly all over the place and then light Rob on fire, who then stumbles around the area and sets somebody else on fire. And then this somebody else happens to die because of the fire. Now their point was that the logs would be able to trace that guy's fiery death back to Ben's original arrow, granting him the credit for the kill. which is of course also pretty cool. But even if you just think about this example of the A.I.R system, you can really see how it can turn the battlefield into a little bit more of a chaotic mess, because maybe this plant was supposed to fire its pollen sac projectile at somebody who was standing behind the wall before it was there, and fired it, and then the firewall went up, the explosion happened, a lot of fire flew through the area and set a bunch of people on fire. That is a really cool thing that can turn into something incredibly hilarious. And interactions like these absolutely have the possibility of keeping Camelot Unchained a lot more fresh over the years, because as we know, Camelot Unchained is a lot more focused on PvP and doesn't really have all those other bells and whistles in terms of PvE content that other games may have. And because that's the case, well, the PvP does have to be pretty fun, and these sort of effects can turn the PvP more fun. Now, of course, if you have a lot of chaotic interactions between different projectiles and spells that all explode and do all sorts of nonsense, the battlefield can also become a little bit cluttered and hard to keep track of. And that is kind of why I'm worried that this system might not become as fleshed out as maybe right now we would all like it to be. But we'll just have to wait and see. It is definitely a really cool idea. And if they can pull it off, I'm sure it would absolutely be a fun system. Alright, that concludes our basic combat gameplay section of Camelot Unchained Examined. Next time I'm going to look at the progression system, because people are still confused about exactly how you are going to progress in a game that doesn't actually have any questing or structured PvE content. So stay tuned for episode 4 in a couple of days, and this series is going to go on for a while, because there is a lot to talk about and I do not want to let anything out.
But until then, I've been the CloakingDonkey, and I'll see you in another video!